NASCAR has motioned for the team's request for an injunction to be dismissed, and they're not going to approve the transfer of the Stewart-Haas Racing charters to the two teams. Plus, Steve Phelps talks about Chicago charters, as well as what improvements NASCAR has made at their tracks, and Conor Mosack has a new home in 2025. Welcome back to Break Hard. I'm Matt. Full holiday spirit around the Break Hard household. We got the Christmas tree up. We got the lights outside. I got a slate roof, so not going to get up there and walk on that one. But let's get into today's actual news, though. Starting off with NASCAR and their motion to have the team's request for an injunction to be dismissed. NASCAR essentially responded to 2311 Racing and Front Row Motorsport by saying, no, we're just not going to deal with this any longer. The teams would like to have, their request for an injunction that would allow them to participate in 2025 with charters. NASCAR is like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And now we're going to wait for the courts to decide what they're going to do. Of course, if you remember, the teams have already tried this once. It was denied. They went to appeal. They withdrew their appeal. Now they filed again to try again with new evidence, and they have new circumstances to back this up. In their filing, they redacted multiple of those, the new evidence, multiple versions of that were redacted. And instead, there was one that wasn't redacted, and that was the focus on the release clause, the one that NASCAR went ahead and got rid of out of the open agreement back in the middle of November. And now the teams are like, well, if you did it for that, you should do it for the charter agreement as well, to which NASCAR's like, yeah, we're just not going to do that. We'll get into a little bit of that. I think one of the biggest things to come out of NASCAR's response on Monday was NASCAR saying that they are not going to approve the transfer of the Stewart-Haas Racing charters to the teams. And now I know people are going to get upset about that, but NASCAR's logic behind this is, well, legally sound, because the teams, they didn't sign the new charter agreement. Stewart-Haas Racing signed the charter agreement for those charters. So those charters are already signed, and they're signed up for 2025, essentially under the new charter agreement. 2311 Racing, Front Row Motorsports have not signed that charter agreement. They can't take possession of those because, well, the release clause is in that charter agreement, meaning that they can't sue NASCAR. They can't continue their anti-competitive litigation against the governing body. So they can't get that. And NASCAR is not going to grant them, their new charters because, well, they would have to sign that agreement, and we know the teams aren't going to do that. So those two charters for now will remain with Stewart-Haas Racing. What the future of them looks like, kind of a bit up in the air. Stewart-Haas Racing, Haas Factory Team rather, as they're now known as, is only fielding one car. They're not going to field 2 or 3 cars next season. In theory, if those sales don't go through, then yeah, they could lease them out. They could sell them to NASCAR. Not really sure what exactly is going to happen with those two charters. As it stands right now, the likely scenario of NASCAR only having 30 chartered teams in 2025 is a very realistic possibility with 10 open spots, each and every week. We'll see how all of that plays out, but they're not going to approve the charter. NASCAR in their response says, quote, 2311 Racing and Front Row Motorsports purchased these charters fully aware that they contained a release provision which needed to be accepted for any requested transfer to be considered. And they are not going to accept that, so NASCAR is not going to transfer these charters over to these two teams as their ongoing litigation continues. So those charters are going to sit in purgatory for now. NASCAR also took direct aim at 2311 Racing and Front Row Motorsports, who continue to argue that NASCAR is monopolistic, that they are doing everything they can to make the most money while continuing to put down the teams. NASCAR's response to that is, quote, plaintiffs can see that the charters are worth millions of dollars, and NASCAR increased the revenues available to the teams after the last round of negotiations. This behavior is the exact opposite of what one would expect from a monopolist. If NASCAR truly had market power, it would be decreasing its demand for plaintiff services and lowering the amount by which it compensates them. So NASCAR's like, hey, listen, we're not anti-competitive because we're giving you more money, which by the sounds of it, the TV revenue will now be really high in the team's favor, like nearly 50% up from 20-ish percent, 25-ish percent they were getting underneath the previous charter agreement, revenue deal, which came out of that. So NASCAR's like, it's hard to argue that when we're giving you guys more. NASCAR also thinks that the teams just lack any sort of merit in this case going forward, saying, quote, stripped of its bluster, plaintiff's complaint reflects nothing more than dissatisfaction with business negotiations that didn't go their way. Essentially, they're like, hey, listen, they didn't get what they wanted. They want to take their ball and go home, or they want to completely try to revolutionize the way business is done here, but 13 of the 15 other teams went ahead and signed it. They didn't, so it's really just them being upset that things didn't go their way. And realistically, the teams are really only only upset about 2 provisions that are within this new charter deal, and NASCAR talks about that in their filing on Monday when they say, quote, despite dramatic rhetoric in the complaint seeking to cast the charters as unlawful, plaintiffs have since told the court that their challenge is limited to 2 specific provisions from NASCAR's 2025 charter offer, the release, and the provision that says there are covenants not to compete, period. So realistically, the teams are like, we want the release clause where it says that you can't, pursue legal action against NASCAR. They want that removed. And they also want the covenant that says that you can't compete. I believe that's the one where like you can't compete outside of NASCAR. I believe that's the one that they're talking about removed. Okay, this feels like we've gone a long way from what they initially wanted to now they're upset about those 2 things. I get it on one hand, but also like, is it worth continuing on with this? Hey, that's not up for me to decide. And last but not least, NASCAR went directly at Curtis Polk, who is one of the co-owners of 2311 Racing. He has been one of the biggest outspoken opponents of NASCAR through this entire process. He's been the one to lead the media charge, float some ideas out there, and NASCAR addresses that head on here when they say, quote, Curtis Polk led the TNC, which was the negotiating committee made up of Hendrick Motorsports, 2311 Racing, Roush Fenway, Joe Gibbs Racing. They say, quote, Curtis Polk led the TNC negotiations and devised various coercive strategies to extract favorable financial and non-financial terms in the 2025 charter negotiations. These strategies included, but are not limited to, boycotts and potential boycotts of NASCAR events, negative media campaign to affect the media rights negotiations, and threats/coercion to other team owners to not break ranks. On information and belief, the establishment of the TNC, as well as other tactics used by plaintiffs and spearheaded by Curtis Polk individually, were for the purpose to extort more beneficial terms, and this litigation is merely a continuation of this scheme. Ooh, so NASCAR not happy with Curtis Polk whatsoever. Now, here's the thing. I'm all for public discourse. I think you need to have guys like Curtis Polk out there, people that are willing to poke the bear, because sometimes things need to get changed. NASCAR not happy about that whatsoever. And yeah, obviously last year or through 2024, there were some rumors that floated the ideas that teams could potentially boycott events or boycott NASCAR races, stuff like that. Make a demonstration, make it known that they're all sticking together. Ultimately, that did not happen, but it really feels like Curtis Polk and that team sort of maybe fed that to Adam Stern and others around the garage area to be like, hey, this is a real possibility. Was it ever? Not necessarily, but NASCAR has not forgotten about it. There's something about racers, they never forget. Got long memories there, and NASCAR is no different than that. On Tuesday morning, Steve Phelps was the first guest on the Race Industry Week panel, which you can watch on racer.com or Racer's YouTube channel, Speed Sport, a couple other places. And Phelps talked about a number of different things, especially pertaining to charters as well as the future of NASCAR's schedule and potential OEMs. We'll start off with the charter situation and sort of the parity within NASCAR. Phelps, big proponent of the charter system, which I think if everybody would sit back and look at it, he's 100% right with what he says here, because I think we've all been saying that. Under the charter system, NASCAR has gotten infinitely more competitive. The Gen 7 car has brought a level of parity to the series, but also the charter system encourages what were once back markers to invest in the team and move up, because running better is an increased payout because of that charter. It also makes your charter more valuable. And he mentioned that we've seen back runners start become mid-pack guys, and we're kind of seeing this ebb and flow in here. Yeah, some mid-pack guys start to drop back and then they come back up. That's just the evolution of what NASCAR and any sort of motorsports has been. He also goes on to talk about how there's no longer any start and parks, which he's absolutely right, because the charter essentially has gotten rid of that. We don't have very many open cars showing up, starting, and parking. And for me, that's a good thing. I know there's a lot of people out here, Brock and others, that are big fans of these start and parks, the small underfunded teams, the underdogs. I get it. I get the, wanting to romanticize that type of racing. They didn't add anything to the show, though. They were realistically just field fillers that kind of came out and pitted and everything like that. If you remember back a few years ago, like when Starcom was here, they had a charter, but they were very much a back marker. And we've weeded teams like that out, which I think is probably a good thing going forward. Yeah, I still think that you need to have your small teams where guys can, get their start and teams can move up and stuff like that. But you can't have guys like Derek Cope out here affecting the outcome of races and things like that. People that are just too washed up and shouldn't be on the racetrack. Now, I get it. There's exceptions. We've seen, storybook runs and stuff like that. I get it. I understand it. But at times, there's some massively underqualified people that are out there that realistically shouldn't be. But Phelps didn't stop there. He went on to talk about, their racetracks, the ISC racetracks, Chicago and stuff like that. He said with NASCAR and their 12 tracks, they made a $50 million investment to put permanent fiber in all of their racetracks to improve the connectivity for race fans. And having been to a number of ISC racetracks, yeah, their racetracks are infinitely better, in my opinion, than SMI's racetracks in terms of being able to connect to the internet, watch what's happening, listen to what's happening, check Twitter, all of those things. SMI racetracks feel like they're just still behind, and that's personal preference in my spot, but also like I've been to enough of them now where I'm like, yeah, if you give me my choice, I'm going to go to an ISC racetrack just because I think the facilities are better, top to bottom. He also went on to talk about Chicago, and he had a really interesting quote. He said, quote, "Chicago financially is, we'll say, difficult for us. It cost $50 million to put that race on, and unfortunately, we didn't sell $50 million in tickets or sponsorships, but was it a smart decision for us? I believe it was." And I 100% agree with him. Yes, Chicago is not a money maker, but in the grand scheme of things, Chicago is an absolute necessity to have on the calendar. It's the third biggest market in the country. It's the only street race. It brings a ton of attention to that race. It's like the second highest viewed race in 2023. I can't remember off the top of my head in 2024 what it is, but like you're talking about 5 million viewers tuning in to watch this race. It's intriguing. It gets the casuals to tune in, and it's taking the event to people that didn't previously watch NASCAR. Having gone to that event this past year, I've been the biggest proponent for the Chicago street race. Absolutely loved it. We'll be back again in 2025. Everything about the event is great. But you have all these people that are like, why would you waste all that money when you have Chicagoland an hour outside of Chicago? That right there is the issue. It's an hour outside of Chicago. Nobody wants to drive an hour out into, East Bufu, Joliet. Sorry, they just don't want to do it. Yeah, the Blues Brothers filmed there. Yeah, it was cool to see that. No, nobody really wants to go to Joliet. So, unless you're visiting your loved ones in the prison, in which case, my condolences or mazel tov or whatever you're going to say to that. So nobody wants to go out there. People want to go to the city. Listen, I'm not going to Chicago to go to Chicagoland Speedway. I'm going to Chicago to go to the street race because it's a great event. The accessibility is fantastic. The entire weekend, top to bottom, really, really good. And sometimes it's worth wasting the money, essentially, to have that exposure, to build up the brand. And that's what NASCAR's understanding with this. And that's why they're doing it. Yeah, people are like, well, the Gen 7 car is going to race really well at Chicagoland. I agree with you. It probably would. But they're willing to sacrifice one race when you have 2 Kansas races, 2 Las Vegas races, 2 Darlington races, Homestead, Charlotte, Texas, all these other racetracks where you can go watch that same style of racing on an intermediate track, taking one of those races out to put it into the literal streets in the heart of the third biggest market in the country makes a lot of sense. I know people don't like Chicago. People want to mark it up to whatever sort of political angle they want to take. We're not here to discuss any of that because it tells me you haven't been to the event. The event was absolutely fantastic. And I hope that they continue to do a street race, whether that's in Chicago or not. I would love for it to be a staple on the calendar. But Phelps also went on to talk about a new OEM, and he says that he's bullish on adding a new OEM in the near to medium future. Short to medium future, I believe is what he said, which again, I know people are going to say like, yeah, we've been hearing this for the last, 12 years, ever since Dodge left at the end of 2012. And they're not wrong. Like we have been hearing this. Oh, they're having conversations with Dodge, Honda, whoever else. And we haven't seen it happen yet. So I get the tempered expectations, but it really does feel like NASCAR has done a lot of data gathering for a potential new OEM to come in, a fourth OEM. And whether that's Honda or somebody else, it feels like we're closer than we have been in years past. So we're going to have to wait and see on that. But I did appreciate the sort of candidness of Steve Phelps. And last but not least, Conor Mosack has a full-time home in 2025. He'll be joining the McAnally Hillman team over at MHR. He'll be driving the number 81 truck. It previously was the number 43 truck of Daniel Dye, who is moving up to Colleague in the Xfinity Series. in 2025. Blake Bainbridge will be his crew chief next year as well. Blake did help Daniel get to the playoffs, so Conor's got a good one on top of the box there for him as well. Conor, if you guys remember, like 2 or 3 years ago, was a bit of a missile out there, not even a cruise missile. Well, maybe he got locked on to his targets usually and ended up taking them out, and honestly, not really intending to. He just didn't necessarily know how to drive ovals that well. Having said that, the guy has, over the last year, become a pretty formidable oval racer. He has 4 top 10 finishes on ovals in the Truck Series in 2024 with Spire Motorsports. He has an oval win in the ARCA Series, so that's great, considering I did watch this guy drive into the corner at Charlotte and just run through people like they weren't even in front of him and then be like, I don't know how it happened. Okay, but really talented road racer. Finished P6, I think, at the Chicago Street Race for Junior Motorsports earlier this year. He's definitely a guy that can get you a race win on a road course. Will be interesting. The Truck Series, I believe, has 3 road courses coming up in 2025. So that could be big for him, but also he's become a pretty formidable oval racer as well. And MHR continues to have a pretty good lineup heading into next year. They will have, once again, Tyler Ankrum will be back there in the 18 truck. You have Daniel Hemrick in the 19, and now you have Conor Mosack in the 81. Probably expect to see a 4th truck there, sort of on a rotating basis with them, as they've done with the 91 this year. We'll see how all of that goes. But for Conor, great landing spot for him. Still a few truck rides and Xfinity stuff to sort out going forward. But silly season is definitely starting to quiet down a little bit as we get closer to the end of the year. So let me know in the comments what you think about the 2311 Racing, FRM ongoing lawsuit, NASCAR saying no, essentially. Steve Phelps comments, as well as Conor Mosack's new home. Like and subscribe to the channel. Follow me on TikTok at BreakHard, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at BreakHardBlog.